to World 360's year-end special presentation, World at War. I'm Akanksha Swarup. 10 months on, and the war in Ukraine continues as we speak. Millions of displaced civilians are unable to return home. Those still in the country are forced to live without access to food, water, healthcare, even essential supplies. With no end in sight, we look at how the war in Ukraine has impacted the world. And before we dive deep with our guests, here's a quick report. February 24, 2022. Air raid sirens cut through the morning calm in Kyiv. This as the Russian President Vladimir Putin declared war on Ukraine.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
He called it a special military operation. And Europe found itself in the middle of a war. A first since World War II. The international community went into a huddle, with Russian forces advancing on Kyiv, and the man holding the fort was Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. With Ukrainian troops outgunned and outnumbered, the world expected Russia to succeed swiftly and ferociously. But Ukraine resisted. What followed was global condemnation, sanctions, restrictions, and even intermediation.
Flagrant violation of the UN Charter and the basic principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity.
No territorial acquisition resulting from the threat or use of force shall be recognized as legal.
This shame and a lie with some kind of pseudo-referendums, confessions of some sort, and annexations will end for Russia in even greater shame.
But Ukraine continued to suffer. Even as this war has no clear winner, Russia has taken over a part of Ukrainian territory, with 4 regions annexed in the month of September. Catastrophic is the word that defines this war's global repercussions. Be it the millions displaced or left food insecure, the war in Ukraine has had a domino effect. Not just food, but critical raw materials, manufacturing products, and trade ties are also disrupted. Sanctions, boycotts, pullouts have heaped new pressure on global energy industry. And worst hit is Europe, Russia's biggest energy customer. EU is now scrambling to keep its residents warm. Global gas prices have hit multi-year highs. As a result, the world is staring at a bleak economic outlook, while Russia continues to accuse the West of tainting the world order. Bureau Report, CNN News 18. And our first guest today is Ambassador John Bolton, who joins me live. As we all know, Ambassador Bolton is an influential voice in American foreign policy, a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and the former National Security Advisor of the United States. Many thanks to you, Ambassador Bolton, for joining in on my show. Now, Ambassador, the Russian invasion of Ukraine will complete a year in February. In hindsight, what have been the key pivotal moments that may have surprised not just Russia, perhaps the international community too?
Well, I think everybody was very surprised at the poor performance of the Russian military on a sustained basis from the beginning of the invasion right until the present day. It's common knowledge in Washington that in the first days after the invasion, U.S. military and intelligence officials briefed Congress on what they expected to happen. And what they said was they thought the capital, Kyiv, would fall in a matter of days and the whole country would fall in a matter of weeks. So it wouldn't be surprising if that's what American intelligence thought. And that was consistent with what other NATO countries saw as well. It wouldn't be surprising if that's what the Russians thought would happen. So the performance of the Russian military, combat arms elements of the military, really had to surprise most of the rest of the world, number one. Number two, I do think the performance of the Ukrainian military has been outstanding.
Right.
They've been courageous. The population has withstood enormous deprivation and outright attack by the Russians, going after civilian infrastructure like electrical power generation facilities. But their resolve has not faltered at all, and remains very strong today. And I think finally the Russians were very surprised at the reaction of NATO. It's been far from perfect. I don't think the U.S. performance has been what it could be, but certainly NATO, which French President Macron said last year was brain dead, showed that it was anything but. And in fact, the final surprise is that abandoning 75 years of neutrality, Finland and Sweden now seek to become NATO members.
Very well said. Ambassador, if we rewind back to January this year, the Biden administration was criticized for not being able to stop the Russian invasion despite military and intelligence capability. Do you see this as a catastrophic American failure?
Yes, I do think it was a failure. It's the objective should not be to win the war. The objective should be to prevent the war. But I think in the Kremlin, looking at a variety of things, the fact that in 2014 they had invaded Ukraine for the first time and suffered insignificant penalties for it, insignificant sanctions and consequences, which could well have led Putin and the others to believe that they'd get the same reaction this time. And then I think also the American and NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan in the summer of 2021, which was a huge mistake on our part, also contributed to the Russians feeling that they could get away with this second invasion of Ukraine. And I have to say, listening to what President Biden said earlier this year, it was almost as though he didn't think he could deter the Russians from invading. And I just think that's wrong. I think a number of things could have been done. And I think particularly in Beijing.
Ambassador, the U.S. is set to send precision bomb kits and Patriot missiles in its next Ukraine aid package. Do you still think that the Biden administration is lacking a national security strategy to succeed in Ukraine, that too at a time when Zelensky is visiting the United States?
Yes, I think that it's still a day late and a dollar short in the provision of much of the assistance. Going back to the famous Polish request to transfer Soviet-era MiG jets to the Ukrainians, which the U.S. rejected. Look, Ukraine's been invaded, completely unprovoked aggression. The war is being fought on the territory of Ukraine. The civilian population has suffered greatly. The infrastructure of Ukraine is being destroyed. Our objective should be to not just to prevail, but to prevail as soon as we can to reduce the humanitarian tragedy that's unfolding. And I think U.S. is the leader of the NATO alliance. We have to be responsible for this, and I just don't think we have a coherent endgame.
Let me also refer to what the top U.S. General Mark Milley has said, that it's important to negotiate from a position of strength, and right now Russia is on its back. Do you agree with him that now is the time for Ukraine to negotiate?
Well, I'm not sure what prompted General Milley to make that observation. That's not normally what a military commander would say. It ought to be for the State Department. But I think, again, we have to look at this not simply as the Russian aggression of 2024, but the Russian aggression of 2014 as well. And so I think at least at this point, the Finnish prime minister a few weeks ago was asked, what's the end? How does this end in Ukraine? And she said, how does this end in Ukraine? It ends when the Russian troops leave. That's how it ends in Ukraine. And I think for now, that's the only position to take. The Russians have to be defeated here, not simply stalemated. There has to be a defeat. And I think ultimately, I hope it has an impact in Russia as well, that they see that this approach has been totally unproductive from their point of view.
How do you ensure complete Russian defeat when I know there is talk about reducing global dependence on Russian energy exports. But how can that be achieved when its biggest customers like India find Russian energy more advantageous and economical?
Well, I think the U.S. could contribute to the solution of that problem if the Biden administration would allow more drilling for oil and gas in the United States. We've got plenty. We'd love to export it. And I think from India's point of view, this is a very significant decision. I mean, the main adversary that I think we face in the 21st century is going to be China. Russia is increasingly becoming a subordinate partner of China. And India's long relationship with Russia during the Cold War, its purchase of sophisticated weapons systems from the Russians for many years, now this increased purchase of oil and gas, is making India more dependent on a junior partner of China. This can't be a good thing from India's point of view.
All right. Ambassador Bolton, just days ago, the Russian Defense Ministry released a video showing the installation of a Yars intercontinental ballistic missile into a missile silo. With so much chatter about Putin's nuclear threats, how do you assess the risk of a nuclear strike on Ukraine?
Well, I think the risk of the use of nuclear weapons at this point is still low. I think Putin is bluffing. I always take this seriously. It has to be evaluated carefully. But I think Putin, this is part of the psychological warfare, if you will, against Europe in particular, to see if the Russians can break the resolve of the Germans, the French, and possibly others, to scare them, to intimidate them, to bully them, to back off their support of Ukraine. I could imagine Putin using nuclear weapons only in extreme circumstances where Russia was in total flight out of Ukraine, or where Putin's own domestic political standing was really in jeopardy, which is not the case yet. So I think, as I say, we always take it seriously, but so far I think Putin's bluffing.
All right. Ambassador Bolton, now the missile incident in Poland that during the G20 in Bali serves as a warning in terms of how the Ukraine conflict could potentially spill over into a wider war between Russia and the NATO. Is NATO doing enough to bring Russia to the negotiating table?
Well, I think parts of NATO are doing very well. I think Poland, the Baltic republics, other Central and Eastern European countries, but again, in some of the major players in the European Union are still not stepping up and meeting their responsibilities. And this is what Putin is counting on. He's counting on a lack of resolve among key European leaders.
Who are these major players when you talk about these major players in EU?
Well, specifically Germany and France, the two biggest economic players in the European Union. There are others that I'm worried about, Hungary, for example. Some worry about Italy. NATO's cohesion is not guaranteed. And we've had a lot of rhetoric about how strong NATO is. And I think its performance has been better than a lot of people have expected. But it's not what it could be. And again, the importance of this plays out not simply in Ukraine, although that's the principal area of focus. It plays out in what the rest of the world sees and what's happening there. And if they see a lack of Western resolve, we will pay the price later.
Okay. Ambassador, do you agree that the war in Ukraine has shown us the limitations of multilateral diplomacy, especially the Security Council?
Well, I think there's no doubt the current Security Council is broken and has been for quite some time. The problem is I don't see it changing anytime in the near future. I don't see either Russia or China acceding to any new permanent members. Charter of the United Nations is very clear. To change the charter, which you have to do to add permanent members to the Security Council, requires the approval of the existing permanent members. So I can tell you, as a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and I've worked in UN affairs for many years, China's been blocking India from becoming a permanent member for decades. And I'm afraid it's not going to change. So I don't think the UN...
Why won't it change, Ambassador?
Because the Chinese are very rational and they don't want to see India as a counterpart to China in the Security Council. I don't see that changing, and I think it just demonstrates that on the really big issues that confront us internationally, Security Council is going to be a minor player.
All right. And Ambassador, since you mentioned China, India's recent standoff with China and India's Tawang has made many Indians wonder how far can India rely on the US for support, something that was also being asked at the time of the Galwan clash in 2020. I know in the past you've said that there was no guarantee that former US President Donald Trump will back India against China, but will the current US President back India like he has in the case of Taiwan?
I think it's much more likely, but I think this points to the changing reality that we're facing in the world. One of the things that I do give the Biden administration credit for was having the first in-person head of state meeting of the Asian Quad, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. I think more needs to be done in this forum. I think at the highest levels of both the Indian and U.S. government, we have to have more strategic discussions. We have to figure out what the relationship should be. I'm perfectly prepared to make it much closer, and that would establish a basis, I think, for feelings of greater security. But there are a lot of issues to discuss. We shouldn't minimize the difficulty, but I think we need to get on with it sooner rather than later, because the potential threat from China is growing daily. And if we don't address it in a systematic fashion, they will be calling the tune rather than us.
Right, Ambassador. And this is my last question to you. At a time when India is assuming the presidency of two global bodies, the G20 and the UNSA, how do you weigh in on India's prospects to mediate in the Ukraine war?
Well, I would just caution against thinking that there's a mediating role to play. I mean, this is a case where Russia engaged in unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. So I think India has a much larger role to play in the world. There's no doubt about it. But in the circumstances we face now, it's something that I think requires a lot more focus on where the main strategic threats to India come from.
Many thanks to you, Ambassador Bolton. It's been a pleasure to have you on my show. And with that, it's time to slip into a quick break. Don't go anywhere, because we'll be back with more on World 360.
Protocols